Start off with approval of the minutes from February 11th and February 13th. Are there any additions or corrections? Seeing none, is there a motion to approve?
Ms.
Representative Pickert. Second. From Representative Stocksdale. All in favor say aye. Aye. All opposed? Motion carries. All right, as soon as everybody's ready here, we have a presentation on the Kansas Reservoir water supplies. And Connie, are you going to start us?
Thank you. Good morning. Connie Owen with the Kansas Water Office, and I'm here to just give a very brief introduction and to thank Chairman Minix and the committee for inviting us here today. As he said, you will hear about reservoir sedimentation and our public water supply contracts. You'll be hearing from John Shelley, hydraulic engineer and sedimentation expert with the Corps of Engineers, and from Richard Rokel, who is the Water Office Public Water Supply Manager. So without further ado, I'll let John take it away.
All right, well, thank you for having me. And as said, my presentation is about reservoir sedimentation and sustainability. But more accurately stated, I guess, it's about water supply security, because eastern Kansas and fully 2/3 of the population of the state depend on the reservoirs for their water supply. And just backing up, before we built the dams, all the sediment that was washing in to any reach of the river also was washing out. And what you see on the screen here is a actual scaled to scale version of Tuttle Creek Lake. So before the lake was built, all the sediment washing down the Big Blue River continued washing out all the way to the Kansas River. But then we built Tuttle Creek Lake. And that creates this real quiet water of the lake. Now all the sediment that comes in deposits in the lake. Close to 100%, in fact, of the sediment, in the upper 90% of the sediment deposits in the lake. This is scaled off of a graph in Excel. This shows you how much sediment deposited as of 1983. So you look at all that open water when the dam was built, and you see there's quite a bit less water than in 1983. And as you go forward in time to 2009, additional sediment depositing, and we've got additional surveys, but just to kind of jump forward in time to 2074, what our projections are. And you see lots and lots of sediment and hardly any water. And they're basically, drinking water. It's like a cup of drinking water. You got 1 cup of water, but if you have it half full of sand, now you only have half a cup for water. And as it gets more and more full of sediment, you have less and less room for the water, and you can't drink the mud. Also, you can't use the mud for cooling water for your power supply. So there's a lot of uses for the water, and the mud just doesn't do it. This is a map showing how much of the original multipurpose pool is available. The first number here is what is available as of 2024. And then the next number shows in 25 years, in 50 years, and 100 years, how much of that original water supply will be available. And what you see here, this is the northern half of the state in the Kansas River Basin. Tuttle Creek Lake is about half full of sediment right now. There's about half of your original, 51% of your original storage. And then after 25 years, after 50 years, after 100 years, we're basically losing the entire lake to where there's hardly any water storage left. Canopolis Lake as well kind of stands out as being pretty badly impacted already and on a trajectory of filling in very significantly. But basically all the lakes are filling in to one degree or another. Here's a graphic of the rest of the large lakes in Kansas, and the size here indicates how much original storage was available, and then you can tell how much of that now is sediment as of this graph is as a projection to 2070. And another really important lake in this discussion is John Redmond Reservoir, which is not as large as Tuttle per se, but it's very important because it's supplying cooling water to a nuclear power plant downstream. So reservoir sedimentation really is the #1 water supply threat for eastern Kansas. Thousands of acre feet are being lost every single year. Every single year we are losing significant storage. And without intentional significant action, the lakes will fill with mud. And the cities of Manhattan, Topeka, Lawrence, and Johnson County will be without water during a major drought. It's not a matter of if, it is a matter of when. And it's not right away, but it's something that we can predict in coming decades that we're on that trajectory. So I'm going to put this a little bit in a national perspective. I'm going to talk about, can we reduce the sediment loads coming into the lake, touch on that briefly. Then I'm going to talk about a novel dredging project, so sediment removal project at Tuttle Creek Lake, and some ideas for John Redmond, and just end with some next steps. So here's a bit of the national perspective. I analyzed 162 Corps of Engineer lakes across the country where there was enough data to do this. And this graph shows you what percentage of the original water storage or multipurpose pool is available now. And quite a few of them have lost maybe up to about 20% of their storage due to sedimentation. But then we get some that have lost, up to 40%, some that are kind of in the 50, 60% range. And then we have a few that have lost already nearly all of their storage. And so Tuttle Creek Lake, John Redmond, and Canopolis fall in this category here, where they're in that 40 to 60% of the remaining of their original storage is left. Perry, Elk City, and Council Grove are in this next category over, where it's 60 to 80% is left. And so we're definitely kind of on the worser end of this distribution. Now, if you wonder about those 4 reservoirs that have already lost nearly all of their storage, those are in Oklahoma, Iowa, and Ohio. So there's actually a definite Midwest problem, not just a Kansas problem. But Kansas definitely has some lakes that are among the worst off. All right, when I talk about this topic, everybody wants to bring up the idea of, well, can we reduce the sediment loads coming into the lake? And you hear the adage, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, and so everybody wants this to be the solution. And I hate to throw a wet blanket on it because it is a valuable thing to do. Some amount of sediment reduction is worth doing, but the benefits may take decades to accrue. We still haven't seen the benefits from the last 20 years of work. And there's been a lot of work done to try to stabilize riverbanks and implement conservation practices. And if you look at the measurements at the gauges that are monitoring how much sediment comes in, they haven't shifted. So it might be additional decades before you see that benefit. The cost per cubic yard of storage retained is about 3 times more expensive to do the work in the watershed than what we're estimating it to be to do the work in the lake. It's just there's an economy of scale to remove sediment after it's been collected than it is to try to go to all of the places and implement things. There's uncertainty with the benefits, and there's some research showing stabilizing one bend may actually destabilize the next bend downstream and actually upstream. So there's some uncertainty into how much benefits you're really getting. So the bottom line is not that you don't do this, but just realize this is not the solution. It might be a small part of an overall plan, but you will have to do work in the lake if you want to realistically manage the problem. And there are lower cost methods that need to be researched for the stabilization aspects to bring those costs down. And that could be a whole separate presentation. But all right, just to address that a little bit up front, I'll jump in now to the water injection dredging project in Tuttle Creek Lake. All right, I'm going to play a movie, so you'll want to watch the screen. Yep, that's working there. And okay. I'm going to try to play that again. All right, well, you'll see it in kind of a little bit of stop frames instead of smooth. But what we have here is it's a flume down in Mississippi, but it's been filled with sediment from Tuttle Creek Lake. And we take this, just a PVC pipe with kind of a riser on it there, a little manifold with water, and we're jetting the water into the sediment, and it's stirring up and making kind of a muddy layer of that Tuttle sediment. And then that layer is traveling on its own. Just the fact of it stirring it up and creating this muddy water layer, the sediment travels. And it's because the muddy water is denser than the rest of the water, kind of the same process by which a salt wedge could travel on the bottom of a river. You can actually have a muddy water wedge that travels on the bottom of a lake. And there's a YouTube link here that you can actually see this on YouTube later if you want to look it up. I think if you even just search for water injection dredging flume, you might find this video. But what's happening there is the sediment is transferring all on its own. And this flume is completely flat, and so it's pretty striking. So this is a novel type of dredging called water injection dredging. And it's been implemented in some ports and some harbors and some navigation channels around the world, especially in Europe, but some in the United States. But it's never been used in a lake before. So we have a water injection dredging demonstration project, which will be the first time in the world that this technology is implemented in a lake. And we're implementing it in Tuttle Creek Lake. So we're very excited about this. Not only will this be the first test of this technology in a lake, but this will be the only Corps of Engineers lake, of which I'm aware, where we are intentionally passing large quantities of sediment downstream. So there are some lakes in the Pacific Northwest where the lake is drawn down and they're passing juvenile salmon downstream, and in the process, they're also passing a lot of sediment, but that's kind of a side benefit, not the main point of the project. So this will be a project for sediment management that will prove both the technology and also the act of passing sediment downstream. And we will be moving dirt, so to speak, this year. So the project will actually be operating in the summer and then again in the fall of this year, and potentially as well in the spring of 2026, which we will find out very soon if that one's going to happen. We've awarded a contract to the company is Michaels, and with a competitive bid process, they got the contract, and they have selected Custom Dredge Works, which is a company in Topeka, to fabricate the water injection dredge, which is not off-the-shelf kind of dredge. You know, it has to be uniquely created for Tuttle, so it can reach all the way to the bottom of the lake, et cetera, and also just because it's kind of a novel type of dredge. So the sediment, as it flows towards the dam, then has to be released downstream. So Tuttle Creek Lake has gates at the bottom of the lake, which will be opened up, and along with the water release will also be this sediment release that passes downstream. And we have done a lot of monitoring over the years, and this is the collective we, you know, the USGS, the funding from the Water Office, the Corps of Engineers, all the partners working together, have collected measurements over the years on how much sediment is coming into the lake. So we know what the natural level is for a given amount of water, how much the sediment concentration could be under natural conditions. And so our discharge of sediment is going to stay within that realm of what's natural variability for water coming into the lake. So it's definitely going to be more sediment than is right now leaving the lake. Because right now we have unnaturally clear water leaving the lake, hungry water, it's sometimes called. But this ought to be more in line with the rest of the watershed, how much sediment is in the water. The goal of this project is not to remove a certain volume of sediment. It is to test the technology, and it's to answer questions about the technology and to answer questions about the effects of releasing sediment in the channel downstream. So how can water injection be optimally performed in a lake setting? Since this is the first time, there's a lot of questions. For instance, should the dredge start near the dam and work its way upstream, or should it start upstream and work its way down? Or should it go up and then down on the same line? The basic questions like that. How fast should the dredge move? So we've got ideas from the literature and from some other settings, but because this is the first time it's been done in a lake, we're going to test a number of variables and see what's optimal for operating in Tuttle Creek Lake. So that'll be the summer kind of dedicated to answering those types of questions. Then in the fall, we'll be asking more questions like, well, now that we know the best way to operate, if we operate optimally, what's the production rate? How many cubic yards per hour can we actually get to leave the lake? And what will then be the cost per cubic yard? And then along with that, we've got a very robust monitoring program downstream. So we're monitoring water quality, we're monitoring ecology, we're monitoring geomorphology, so how is the bed changing, or the sandbars shifting character, things like that. And so during the short-term test, we'll get better information about what the effects are of restoring a large sediment load to, to the Big Blue in the Kansas River. Okay, I'm sure you'll have a lot of questions on some of these topics, but just going to move on for now to John Redmond. So Tuttle Creek Lake has those gates at the bottom, which lets us do something like water injection dredging. John Redmond, on the other hand, has gates that are up off the bottom. They are 21 feet above the bottom of the lake. So you can't just create a turbid density current and get it to the dam because it won't leave the lake, because it would have to go up for quite a distance. So we need a different technology at John Redmond. And that's kind of the case. Every lake is a little different with the infrastructure that's available, what the downstream conditions are, as to what technology you might use. There are several where water injection dredging would work, but John Redmond is unfortunately not one of them. However, we're looking at another technology, and it's called hydrosuction. Some of you are getting the taste of gasoline in your mouth when you see this picture. But basically, if you've ever done a siphon of any sort, you know that once you get it started, if you hold the hose lower than the point you're drawing from, that it'll kind of self-perpetuate and continue to suck the liquid out and discharge it. Well, you can actually do this, and you can suck a sediment slurry out and discharge it. And it's called hydrosuction. It has been done in Nebraska on a small dam, and it's been done in a number of places. If your dam is small enough, you can go up and over the dam with the pipe, and by siphon, you can pass sediment downstream. With a large dam, there's some physics involved that you can't go up and over, but if you have a means of going through, you could still do this. And this has a lot of cost advantages compared to traditional dredging in that you're not having to use diesel fuel or electric to supply the pumping. Just the lake itself with that head difference of the water being high on one side and low on the other is supplying the energy to move the sediment. And John Redmond actually has an unused water line that the state of Kansas already paid for a number of years ago, but it's not being used right now. So it's really well suited to do a hydrosuction project because the conduit is already available. So there's a company out of Norway called Sedicon that has done a half a dozen or so of these kinds of projects, mostly in Central and South America. And so this is an example of one of their projects in Guatemala, where they've got a small barge and they move it around in the lake, and they jet some water to loosen up the sediment, but then they don't have to pump the sediment. That's just done from the siphon action. And they pass it downstream. So the Water Office has issued a contract with Sedicon to do a cost estimate and kind of 35% level design for John Redmond. Just so we kind of get in the ballpark of how much money are we talking about to implement something like this. And we've got it specified two different ways. If it was a temporary demonstration, how much would it cost? Or if it was a permanent installation, how much would it cost? And so they are working on that right now, this company, Sedicon. Now, that said, there's a lot of analysis and coordination needed because downstream from Tuttle, you've got the Big Blue River flows into the Kansas, to the Missouri, to the Mississippi, all the way to the ocean, with no other major impoundments. Downstream from John Redmond, you have another dam in Oklahoma. So the sediment you discharge from Redmond is going to end up in Grand Lake in Oklahoma. So there's a lot of analysis needed, coordination about the downstream issues at John Redmond that we didn't really have to do in the same way for Tuttle. However, this will be a first step, just knowing kind of what we think it might cost, right, to do this kind of project. Okay, so let's talk about some next steps. There are steps related to the engineering technology, the water injection dredging demonstrations, kind of an example of that. There's a lot of questions about the technology, and we're going to get some answers this year from that. There are also next steps related to environmental permitting. I think John Redmond is a really big example where that's probably the long tent in the pole, the long item on the critical path. is that kind of environmental downstream fate of the sediment piece. And then there are next steps related to funding. So funding a short-term demonstration versus funding a kind of a permanent long-term new maintenance regime for a lake is a very different question. And so there's going to be major funding needs in order to actually solve this problem. The Corps of Engineers has several things in the, coming down the pike. At Tuttle Creek Lake, there has been a request for our fiscal year 27 work plan to do a major rehabilitation project. So when we do a major rehab project of a dam, usually it's correcting some structural deficiency or replacing a gate or some major cost for O&M. But we've put in sediment management under this kind of request for major rehab project. It's also been co-requested as a general investigation study, so kind of two different ways that the Corps could implement a major project. And we're not sure which way will end up being the one that the agency wants to go with, but we've got both of those in there. Canopolis Lake as well, there's been a request for a major rehab project put in through the 27 work plan. John Redmond Lake, there has been a request in the 27 work plan put in for a hydrosuction demonstration. And I say 4 million, it was actually 4.5 million that they put in the request. Now that request was also in a previous year and wasn't, nothing came of it. And that's kind of the problem with spending a lot of money on something new is everybody has current needs that are right now and there's not a lot of appetite to spend money on something that, yeah, it's a problem, but we see it coming as a problem in coming years. But these requests have all been put in, and so just making you aware, there's definitely interest to want to work on this and a recognition that these are issues to work on. Okay, some of you are very familiar with reservoir sedimentation, and you've heard me present before, and you've been to other presentations on this topic. Some of you very new to this. In any case, if you want to learn more about this and you've got a commute that you want to fill some time with, there's actually a podcast. I have a colleague in California who made a river mechanics podcast, and he did a whole lecture series interviewing reservoir sediment management experts. And they talk about this topic. And it's a great way to get a little bit familiar with some of the options, some of the issues with reservoir sediment management. If you go to your podcast and you look up RSM River Mechanics, you will find these interviews with George Annandale, with Greg Morris, and then with myself and a colleague in Omaha, talking about reservoir sediment management. Okay, that's what I have for a presentation, but what questions do you have for me?
Questions? Representative Blacks?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Shelley, for your presentation. That slide on hydrosuction down in my part of the country, we call that the Oklahoma credit card for getting gas. Question to you, at what point do you make a determination either in the hydraulic dredging or the hydrosuction? Are you just going to write off certain portions of the upper end of that lake? In other words, they're so far silted in that they're past the point? Or are you just going to, and at what point, how do you make that determination? I suppose you do some depth analysis, but a lot of that's already gone.
Right. Yeah, so the sediment that is close to the dam is going to be easier and cheaper to get to leave the dam, for sure. And so the hydrosuction and the water injection dredging would all be targeting that sediment close to the dam. And if your concern is water supply, it doesn't really matter if it was here or if it's there, so you kind of go after the closest one. But to your point, we have lost significant acreage of the lake, Tuttle Creek Lake. It's also about half lost in terms of the surface area, and that's at the upstream end. The sediments up there tend to be coarser. They're the more the sands and the gravels, and they're farther away from where you want to transport them. So I imagine that when we do the major rehab project, we will have to look at that question really closely, and that's just it's kind of a decision to make because it's more expensive the farther away from the dam you go.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Representative Gardner?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just wondered if you had any information for us about these reservoirs, particularly of interest to me is John Redmond, because I'm very familiar with that. And do we know what, even in rough estimates, what percent of the sediment is coming down the Neosho River, and what percent of it's coming out of the Cottonwood River, which drains mostly Flint Hills, whereas the Neosho is mostly farm ground, or a lot of farm ground between Burlington and Council Grove. And do we know what percent is coming, what distance to it? Is this coming from farm ground and other ground up around Hartford and Neosho Rapids? Or are we looking at in sediment coming from Chase County and on up into Morris County? And I specifically ask that because, you know, that should impact our public policy about mitigation of further infiltration of sediment.
So I guess to answer your question succinctly, I don't know how much is coming from one branch versus the other. And I don't know, have you looked at that specifically? Do you know that number? It's in progress, okay. So we'll have some more information on that. To the question on what percentage is coming off of, you know, farm fields, sort of the major sources of sediment would be either off the farm fields or would be off the channel banks. And there is a project underway to answer that question for all the major lakes in Kansas. Some of that work has been done. I think it was in Perry Lake's watershed, and it was kind of close-ish to half and half of farm fields versus channel bank sources. But that might vary a little bit. But I imagine it's going to be significant from both sources, no matter where we look in Kansas. But we'll have it more specifically in coming months.
One more question. Then, do we know how much this has been impacted by the invasion of woody species, particularly hedge, locust, and all the other trees that have come in? You know, around John Redmond, there's a large wildlife area and so forth. It used to be all farm ground, and now there's a high amount of, and even out into Chase County, a lot of invasion of trees which shade out the grass, and there appears to be a lot more erosion because of that. Do we know what impact that has had and how much that's changed in the last 50 years compared to farm ground?
I am not aware of that having been looked at specifically. My gut reaction would be to say that the trees would actually reduce the sediment loads, but that may not be the case. There might be something specific with shading, but I haven't looked at it specifically.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Representative Pishney?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The previous representatives have mentioned their knowledge about John Redmond. I'm most knowledgeable about Tuttle Creek because it affected our family and our family farm and so forth. And our family farm was involved in trying to reduce some of the sediment flowing into, from the Little Blue flowing into the lake. So I'm very familiar with that. My questions are this. And it's a two-part question, if I could, please. One is, during the project at Tuttle Creek, will that affect usage of Tuttle Creek by the recreational folks?
So, I mean, there will be a dredge operating in the lake. Compared to the size of the lake, it's not huge. There's no pipelines involved in that project, so it's got a much smaller footprint than maybe like a dredging at John Redmond did a few years ago. So there will be some impact. There will be one boat ramp that is sort of dedicated for the contractor's use while they're building the dredge, and then while they're operating the dredge, but in between, it's to be open to the public. So hopefully minimal, but there will be some impact, yes.
And I know our concern is quality and quantity of water, but the recreational piece is an economic driver within Kansas is the reason for my question. My other one is with regard to the sediment, and if we are successful in dredging, how long do we think that is going to last? Or are we going to need to dredge every 10 years or something of that nature? And then related to that, was this type of thing anticipated when the dam was built? And I had family who was working for the Corps that built the dam. And I know we can't go back and undo the past. I understand that. But did we learn from that for any future projects and trying to help and prevent future issues? But again, how long will this dredging be effective for us?
Right. So the demonstration project is, it's short term. It'll be 10 days of dredging in the summer, 10 days of dredging in the fall, and potentially 10 days of dredging in the following spring. But for this to be implemented kind of a long-term basis for long-term maintenance of the lake, it's going to have to be operating all the time. It's not a huge project that you do and walk away. It's every year. If you're losing 3,500 acre feet of storage, every year you're passing 3,500 acre feet of sediment downstream. So it's a continual kind of maintenance operation that would have to happen.
So you see the financial piece of it being an ongoing.
It will have to be. Not for the demonstration,
Right.
but
No,
for long-term implementation, it will have to be a long-term funding source.
I get that. Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
And you had a second question.
Well, it was about what did they anticipate when they built the dam, and
Oh, yes.
and we anticipate that going into the future.
Right. So the general philosophy, they absolutely knew this was going to happen when the dams were built. They actually took very good measurements and made predictions, and using slide rules and old school methods, were remarkably accurate on what would happen. Now, in some lakes they weren't as accurate, but for Tuttle they were remarkably accurate. And the general philosophy was, we'll just build the dam bigger to start with, and it'll just bite us, enough time, and we'll figure it out later. They justified the benefits based on a finite amount of time. The problem is now it's 50, 60 years later, and now we're dealing with it, and we wish they had done some other things to manage sediment as they went along. If there's a lesson for us, it's that when we're doing the cost-benefit analysis of it, are we going to do something kind of permanent, perpetual to solve the problem, or are we going to find something to kick the can down the road, and then our kids or grandkids will be stuck with an even bigger problem and even more expensive? So I hope there is a lesson for us.
My understanding, Tuttle was dammed in 1962. We're 63 years later, and we've lost, and it was built to double the anticipated size or capacity, and we're 48% silted in. So we're kind of to that point right now to start making decisions. Am I close?
Yeah, you're pretty close. Yeah, that's right. It's pretty well on track with those original predictions, but it doesn't, that's when we first started, like maybe 10 years ago, the Corps would say, well, what's the problem? We knew this was going to happen, and it's happening. There's no problem. It's still a problem because you're still losing a lake that is so important, right? But yeah, it's not unexpected. It's pretty much tracking with the predictions.
Representative Vaughn?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have lots of questions, but I'll try and keep it to a couple. On track kind of with the funding question, it's my understanding also that kind of the long-term maintenance sedimentation removal is a lot more cost-effective than manually dredging like we previously did at John Redmond, and that it's hoped that there will be fewer byproducts like having to remove the soil and find a place to put the soil and that kind of thing. So correct me if I'm wrong there, but I think in the long term it's supposed to be cheaper, essentially.
Yes, just the disposal of the sediment is about half the cost of a dredging project. So if you can just pass it downstream kind of at the rate that it's coming in, you can cut your cost in half. So that's true, definitely true.
Okay, and then, so I was thinking about the budget this year. I know, so the hydrosuction pilot that you mentioned, there was a line item in the enhancement recommendations for that for $3 million. It didn't make it into this first round of the budget, to my chagrin. I would love to see that hopefully in the future, but you mentioned in your presentation that the the requested amount was 4.5 million. So I'm just trying to understand the discrepancy there. And then is that requested amount specifically for the pilot or for a demonstration, or what would that 3 million go towards?
So I don't know that I can speak exactly to the 3 million and how that number was come up with. I can speak to the 4.5 million, and it was a very rough. It was a phone call with me, and I'm like, well, how much might you need? And realizing that Tuttle, we thought something, and it came in more expensive. So 3 million might be the best guess, and 4.5 was like, yeah, but it's always more expensive than what you think. But with that contract to Sedicon, where they're doing 35% kind of design and cost estimate, we will have a much better number for what we really think that it will take.
And when do you estimate having that contract proposal?
You guys have an answer there? Several months. So within just a few months. I think they were supposed to give it to us already, in fact, so I think it ought to be here soon. Yeah.
And then can I ask one more question? Okay. What I was kind of curious about your thoughts on preventative measures to sedimentation. So it sounds like whether or not stream bank stabilization, whether or not that's effective is inconclusive, but I mean, what about the effectiveness of other types of measures like buffer strips, or I mean, we look at some of the like no-till options, things like that. Are there opportunities to implement more of those things that could be more effective versus just right at the stream and doing that stream bank stabilization?
So there's a lake in Iowa, Rathbun Lake, that has done a very intensive effort for stabilization and sediment reduction, and they have been able to reduce their incoming sediment loads by doing, quite a few projects. It's not dozens, it's hundreds, and if you scaled it up to the size of Tuttle, it would be like over 1,000 kind of projects that you'd need done. Most of their benefit actually came from building big structures that were like sediment trapping structures, not actually from the stuff we traditionally think about, like cover crops and those kind of things. They did those things, but most of their bang for the buck came from building additional structures. However, their costs still came in about 3 times higher than what the costs were for John Redmond, which we think we can go cheaper even than that with our newer technologies and with passing it downstream. So it's not that it can't be done, it's one that you will have to do it way more extensively than anybody realizes. And then 2, it's gonna end up being more expensive. So if you have $100 million and you put it there, it does not solve the problem the same way it could solve the problem if you had $100 million and you put it into the lake itself.
I want to ask a question as quickly as I can. The cost share between the state and the Corps of Engineers, if we can address that real briefly on the reservoirs that we currently have contracts on and we haven't paid for, and those that we already have paid for.
I'm gonna punt on that because I think you specifically probably, yeah. Okay, they're gonna cover that. That's great. Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I view these reservoirs as a lot like me having to take blood pressure medicine. If I take a scoop front loader of gravel or sand out of a creek, within a few weeks, the next rain event, it's going to be filled up. So this is a maintenance situation we're going to have to get in. My experience in field work indicates that some tributaries contributed a lot, and the ones that have the broad floodplains that have farm ground, will contribute even more. And that situation is the hardest thing to cure because that's also the highest value land for crops and the most difficult to enroll in a cover crop situation. And then we can't, in response to Representative Gardner's question, we cannot eliminate the huge flood events. They drop a bunch of sediment on stream bank situations on good riparian corridor. That happened in 207 in the Verdigris Basin. We had that huge flood, just huge sections caved off, and unfortunately Oologah in Oklahoma got that. And so we can't minimize those. We have no control over them. Even though we think we do, we don't. But there's a lot of things that evolve into that, and I appreciate what you've said. Thank you. Thank you.
Representative Pickert.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for your presentation. So I know there's a lot of variables because we're, just trying to kick around ideas, and then there's the funding issues. But do we have any kind of timeline when we might implement something, for long-term solutions?
So, yes, the Water Office has created kind of I'd say it's like an aspirational timeline, because it involves funding from the federal government to come in at the right moments, and it requires state funding to come in at the right moments. But it's the kind of thing that you do your demonstration, and then you spend probably 3 years looking at how to implement, long-term, and then you actually start implementing, assuming you've got the funding at those steps. And they have actually laid out a timeline of, different dams and which ones to work on for the 6 that are kind of the worst in the state. So I'd say if the funding is available from the state and the federal government, a lot could be done within the next 10 years. If the funding's not available, then we're here in several years later, and Tuttle is smaller, and we still haven't solved it. Right.
Okay, thank you. And then one other quick question. Would it be possible for the Water Committee to go on a tour of the dredging of Tuttle?
So absolutely. In fact, we wrote into the contract with Michaels that they would be providing a tour of the dredge. So we will make sure that we coordinate with the Water Office, and they'll let everybody know who might want to come. So you could actually come on the dredge itself and see it before it's operating, as well as you could come and watch it while it's working.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Seeing no further questions, thank you very much. Next up. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me today. We're going to cover the federal reservoir storage contracts and operations for the state. So this is basically, as John talked about, these federal reservoirs, certain ones, the state we have engaged in and we have contracted to procure the storage. And those storage interests are what we use to basically fulfill public interests of the state for water supply, water quality, basically keeping the rivers of eastern Kansas flowing and providing for the public water suppliers. So going to go through a little bit of history. Some of this kind of really goes along with what John's saying. So most of our reservoirs, these were federal authorizations. So these came from the Flood Control Acts of 44 and 54 and the Water Supply Act of 58. That was a very, very different time and sort of federal infrastructure development and planning and funding and a whole different gamut of environmental sort of conditions, we'll say. So we got a whole bunch, significant number of federal projects that were built, but it's going to be much harder if we, ever have to try to replace these. Or maybe on another point, a lot of the best locations have already been utilized. So in some areas, there were other projects that were identified. So if we do talk what happens if we don't do anything, we got to replace it. If we replace it, it's probably going to be one that's just not as good. It's not going to produce as much water. It's going to be a real pushback and challenge from the public of if we have to try to go in and get more land for another dam. So I would say a lot of the impetus of really getting these dams, and I think there was maybe a perception shift in Kansas after what kind of came through Kansas in the 50s. So there was a 51 flood, wiped out quite a bit of different areas of different cities. And then the drought of 52 to 57. So some of our, older planning documents, kind of back from the 60s, I think they kind of state this pretty succinctly. They're basically like, we're going to dedicate resources to plan so we don't have to basically have the sufferings of the 50s again. So basically most of our dams kind of came out of these authorizations, and I think the state of Kansas really got in support for coming in on these dams following what happened in the 50s. So the Kansas Constitution, it was amended in 1958. Pretty basic sort of change, I think. It basically allowed us to financially sort of engage in the conservation and development of water resources with the federal government. That was followed up by a resolution of the Kansas Legislature. So part of that Public Water Supply Act that I showed earlier is that the federal government would incorporate public water supply functions if there was a local interest that was going to make a financial commitment and basically take on that local water supply interest. So by the change in the Constitution and the legislature's action here, and we made the declaration that we would be the local sponsor. We would be the contributing entity for those first 6 reservoirs, I think is what came in on that. Coming out of that was the Water Resource Planning Act. So this originally was the Water Resources Board, now the Water Office. And this authorized us to recommend the inclusion of water supply within these federal projects. It also enabled us to enter into those contracts with the federal government to contract for and purchase those storage rights. Statute was put in there that allowed us to, let's see, control all waters affecting people of the state, including waters impounded in projects constructed pursuant to the federal government. So out of all that, here's all the federal reservoirs in Kansas. Most of what I'm going to be talking about is directed towards the ones that are in gold here. So the ones that are in gold, those are ones that the state currently does have those storage contracts with, and we have some obligations there for water supply responsibilities. I will point out the state is broken into these 2 Corps of Engineers districts. So you see the north area is white, that would be the Kansas City district. So they have a colonel in Kansas City that oversees those operations, but they can sort of be overruled by the higher levels. So like if it does come to Missouri River sort of things, it is a ranked structure. So Kansas City District gets to do some things, but if we come into Missouri River flood operations and some things like that, then we're kind of dealing with someone else. So that's a variable we'll get to here. The lower part is the gray, that would be Tulsa District. So that they're headquartered down in Tulsa. They operate most of those reservoirs. Cheney Reservoir, it's a Bureau of Reclamation reservoir, but it is operated by the Corps of Engineers just for those operations. Let's see, Water Planning Act. Yeah, so within the Water Planning Act, we do have the policies for our long-term goals, and one would be to develop the adequate storage to meet nearly as practicable to the present and anticipated uses. So, basically telling us how do we have enough storage to meet these needs for what is anticipated. So, it could be a question for how long is that timeline into the future, and that kind of plays into how long it would take to replace some of this infrastructure or to get the maintenance sort of in line to maintain these structures. To your question earlier, Mr. Chairman, the federal storage space acquired, and it's a small font here, but hopefully you can look at it on your printouts. So these are all the different contracts for each of the federal reservoirs. The yellow box, that would be the percentage of the water supply that the state did contract for within that reservoir. Some of these, it was 100% of what I would say the conservation pool storage. Should probably define that. So in the reservoir operation, or sort of that lower level, that's mostly what John was talking about getting filled with sediment. That's going to be your conservation pool. That's what we get to use to maintain stream flows for public water supply. That's what people are generally out there recreating on. So that's where probably 95% of your sediment is ending up in that conservation pool. That's where our water supply interests and our water rights are, is that conservation pool. So above that is the flood pool. That's what the Corps of Engineers operates to mitigate and slow down flood losses. Generally flood operations, that's kind of hands off for the state. That's federal authorities. They really get to dictate that show. We can provide sort of input. We do get stakeholders in different groups that tell us, hey, can you have the Corps of Engineers maybe do that a little slower or change some operations? And we can communicate that, but ultimately if the Corps is trying to push water out and reduce flood risk, that's kind of an all hands on deck thing like we saw in 2019. On the right would be the the red box there would be the percent of O&M that we cover in our contract. And this is a fun little wrinkle here because it does change. Like some reservoirs, it's like 1%. So of overall cost for that reservoir, the state, our portion is 1%. For some of them, the portion goes up to 30, 40%. That is really a function of what that reservoir's role is. So Tuttle Creek, the conservation pool, we like to think it's pretty big, but it's actually fairly small compared to the federal or the federal flood control portion. So our costs are proportional depending on the role of the reservoir. One like Hillsdale, it has a much smaller flood control pool, but most of its function is really for our water supply needs. So the O&M portion is just higher there. So I believe to the prior question about O&M and ongoing costs, and this is where there might be some benefits of if we can strategize this so that this is ran through like a federal process and that there are benefits through the O&M action versus in some cases, the state may save time if we try to go it alone, but then we might not get that sort of cost advantage. Okay, State Water Plan Act. So the first one would be water reservation rights. So for each of these reservoirs, the director of the water office has acquired reservation rights. These are basically our water rights for operating that storage. These do have certain conditions on them. They have a priority date, and we ultimately do have the chief engineer of the Division of Water Resources as our regulator. So there can be times when if flows are doing a certain thing, we have to bypass water. So that can be a little frustrating if you're in a drought and you're bypassing water instead of being able to hold that and use it for the future. But we have our own rights. These are just sort of kind of the wrinkles of all the complications of the storage and water here. Under the Water Plant Storage Act, we have the Water Marketing Program. And so I'll kind of touch on these programs that we use for public water supply now. Water Marketing Program, this is where we issue like direct contracts with entities. So I'll pull out Hillsdale again. Hillsdale Reservoir, there's a portion that is dedicated to maintain flows downstream. We got to keep a little water to keep the creek flowing, but then a good portion is dedicated for water supply for the local entities. And those are handled through a water marketing contract that basically gives the ability for water supply for a good portion of Miami County, Southwest Johnson County, and some Franklin and Douglas County. So water assurance program is different because this is, think of this as a collective group of water rights that will benefit from the operation of the storage in more of a coordinated manner. So a marketing program is like you have one entity downstream, they're releasing water for that one entity for their intake. The assurance program is like a group of cities here, and where there's efficiencies that can be gained by operating the storage for sort of the coordinated effort. And as part of that, we can just kind of be more efficient in the utilization or operation of that storage through drought. And in many parts of the state, it provides the alternative source of supply that the cities or the industry will need to get a new water right. So if you want to have a new industry come in, they're going to need to get a new water right. By the regulations, they're going to need an alternative source of supply, or they're just going to need to supply to be able to sustain through a drought. That's where, if they're part of an assurance program, they can basically buy in to that storage, and then it's a shared, distributed cost mechanism for them then. Lower Smoky Hill Access Program, this is the newest one. This is operated out of Canopolis Lake. It benefits downstream users along the Smoky Hill River and City of Salina. Let's see. So the framework, I think you guys have gotten a presentation on Water Authority and all that before. What I want to interject here is that is sort of, they're the ones that review our contracting, and they are the ones that are the approving body of those contracts. So I just can't go out and cut contracts to whoever I want without sort of running it by the advisory group. So we have 13 voting members on there. Those are appointed by the governor and the legislative leadership, so the Speaker of the House, President of the Senate, and the governor. And then at those meetings, we have the ex officio members of all the different state agencies that kind of deal with water. And there's a map kind of showing the distribution of the voting members there. Yeah. Regional advisory committees, those are the local stakeholder input and communications. So that's where folks do kind of communicate what their priorities are, what the impacts are, and some of the needs from the locals, that what they're kind of wanting us to focus on and address and incorporate within the water plan. All right, so operation and maintenance. We put this on our budget every year. I guess I want to point out, what is on the budget isn't the same line up here. You see there's a state portion due to the Corps. That state portion is for like all the programs all together. So the Assurance District program, they pay their proportional share. The Water Marketing program, it pays its share. The Access District, it pays its share. The remainder is basically what we're asking you all for, and I think that averages around $700,000 or something this year, or something like that is what the state water plan portion of the O&M would be. The portion in yellow there, I do kind of want to point out, because this did create a little budgetary impact especially for some of our rural systems. And it was a couple of these budget lines that cover these larger projects that kind of come through. And in this case, I think the federal budget got a little bit more boost of federal funds, so that allowed them to do some higher ticket projects that they hadn't done for a while. And then there's kind of a trickle down cost as we look for making those payments. Luckily, the Corps of Engineers, there was a change in the WRDA, the Water Resources Development Act, like 10 years ago, and it has them giving us these estimated projections, so we can at least attempt to try to incorporate those in what we're bringing. And then also we are billed 2 years in arrears. So we get a little bit of time to respond to this, but the Corps gets a money infusion and they throw 10 or 20 million at reservoirs. There is a bit of a cost to us. That being said, these are, it is aging infrastructure. The first one was built in the late 40s, the last one was built in the 80s, getting older. It's really kind of like your car. We got to do maintenance on it or bad things happen. So the Corps, they handle this through their contracting or some of their capabilities, some of these larger maintenance projects. Within just the last 6 months, that list on the top right are ones that I know we've had to either change operations a little bit or had to make sort of accommodations in water supply so that they could basically be done. Council Grove is going on right now. They're basically replacing, John showed one of those water pipes that's coming through. They're kind of replacing that corridor. So having to make alternative operations to keep water flowing for the Neosho while they're getting that work done. These two pictures, so the Marion Gates, you might not see it. There's a few $1 million of work the Corps had to do there. And then just this past year, the Tuttle Creek, they had to redo the outlet channel and basically all new rock and concrete and kind of just reinforce everything there. After the 2019 floods, there was, some maintenance that was needed, especially some of these outlet channels. Several of the outlet channels had to kind of be dewatered and gone through to just make sure they're safe. Federal regulation manuals. Think of these are sort of like the rule books for the reservoirs. These are like the operational constraints. There's certain things that you can do with the reservoirs. There's certain things that you can't do. Each reservoir it has certain authorized purposes. So that's the Congress said this reservoir is authorized for flood control, water supply, quality, navigation, these things. These aren't changeable unless Congress comes through. Last time this manual was updated was 1973. You can see in the little red box there. Some of the strategies that are in there, those were developed when we had a lot more storage. We had 40 more 50 more years of storage there. So you can accomplish different things when you got twice as much storage. Manual updates are ongoing. Potential for efficiencies. So like I said, there might be some Some things that we can kind of tweak in there that might make, increase some drought resiliency and kind of allow a little bit more efficient use of storage while also fulfilling all the needs of the basin and the water suppliers. All right, now we'll run through just a couple of these different river basins. Each one's a little different. So Kansas River Basin, so the river just here to the north of us. They have entered into and contracted for storage for Milford, Perry, and Tuttle Creek. So those are the three sort of reservoirs that keep the flows going on the main stem of the Kansas here. As part of that purchase, they pay that proportion of the federal bills, so I pay their share there. For that storage interest, we work through an operations agreement with them, and that basically spells out the terms of how we're going to utilize that storage to fulfill their needs. We revisit that document every 5 years generally, and within that document, they give us a 20-year projection of what their members are going to have for demands. So as we're kind of talking about future planning, is 20 years out far enough? It's a good question. If we have to build another reservoir, it's probably going to take more than 20 years. If we have to increase the height of one, that's going to take multiple years. So yeah, but that's sort of the root problem is we do have some declining storage, as John showed, and in some areas of the state we have increasing demands. So this is just sort of a map of the basin, and let's see if I have, there we go. So on this map, basically the yellow or the gold, these would be your direct diverters, or basically your folks that are the members of the assurance district here. And quite a few of them are cities. But this isn't like a rural or urban issue. This is, or it's a both issue. You see these areas of green that aren't, kind of surrounding the gold. Those are your rural water districts or your public wholesale districts or your other rural entities that are interconnected or sourced by these other members. So the main, like Topeka, may be the one that's diverting it from a weir, but they are interconnected to other systems that deliver that water. So as we kind of talk about this, especially we talk on Neosho or Verdigris River here in a little bit, you have a few points that divert water, and they cover that over a very significant portion of rural Kansas. So, yeah. So the Kansas River Basin, and so I put earlier, the sufficient storage for like that 2% occurrence drought. However, we do get these, we'll say, shorter droughts that are definitely more frequent. So the last 3 years are just a good example. These were pretty quick onset, pretty intense droughts that needed, they're pretty short though, but they need a lot of storage to basically keep the river flowing. So in the top right in that graph, the blue, that's basically the volume of water that Tuttle Creek was releasing. So think of that blue, that's, we're trading what is behind the dam, what we're holding in storage, we're trading that to make the river flow. The dashed line, that's what our flow would have been if the dams weren't there. So if you use Corps of Engineers data and you say what's coming in would be what's going out, you get that dashed blue line if you're not supplementing that flow. Bad thing there is you got water supply systems that are not going to function with that. So specifically in this case, Topeka, you get below that 600 number, they got some issues. So alternatively, the reservoirs, they do serve a function of dilution for the water quality angle. So there's naturally occurring chlorides and sulfates that are coming into the river, generally kind of more from the western portions of the state, and we do use the reservoirs to dilute those. Right now, that's the only method that either the federal government or the state has basically committed to trying to solve that. So, and then I would say that the elevated flows for the icing here. So, yeah, like 3 times in the last couple months, we had to basically boost flows to have enough water in the river. So when the ice comes on, You lose some flow with that icing, but just so the river, there's enough flow to keep all the intakes functioning. So again, that's an example where you're trading, you know, your storage that's in your reservoir for time that you can keep that river flowing and keep your needs met. Last year, the 2023 January 2024 icing event was that was a pretty nasty one. We lost quite a bit of storage and Tuttle Creek having to basically keep flows going at a higher level for about another 2 weeks. So yeah, reservoir volume, it's not a perfect equation, but it's sort of a general idea. Your volume equals the time that you can meet your demands and keep your needs met. That could be the longer the period of your drought. So our planning drought is at 52 to 57, and you know, just that multi-year period of below normal precip and aridity. Or you could deal with a higher intensity drought. So in some parts of the state, not this past fall, but the fall before, if you look at the historical flow records, we might have been a little bit worse off than we saw back in the 50s. So if it comes and goes for a few months, that's where our reservoirs are a good cushion. Lower right, this is just a graph to see basically how does Tuttle Creek respond to this. So you can see it was not too long of a period. Basically August is really when the flows just start tanking. So we had to start dumping water from Tuttle Creek to keep the flow going, and you see kind of how quick it goes. But getting to the not all reservoirs are equal thing here, the benefit of Tuttle is you see how it does bounce back. So that's one of the real benefits of Tuttle Creek is it does have this sort of higher probability for higher intensity events. Those bring dirt with them, which leads to storage loss, but it gives us water, and gives us water that we can use. Some reservoirs are bigger, or larger storage tanks, but the water that comes in isn't as much. So ultimately, if your goal is to fulfill demand, you have to have water coming in to use. You know, John does a lot of engineering and cool number stuff, but the picture on the left, this is Perry Lake. You can kind of see there's an area where it's more brownish. So, I mean, that's just your dirt coming in from a high inflow event. You can see how it's more kind of darkish down towards the dam at the bottom of the picture. So just kind of a snapshot of losing your storage there. So back, Clinton Reservoir, this is the fourth one that's in the Kansas Basin, and it's not used to maintain the flow targets on the main river, but it is used to maintain flows throughout the Wakarusa River. And that is needed for dilution for a treatment plant and to keep that system flowing. This Clinton is one where the water supply allocations, they have been dedicated to the local water suppliers. So yeah, basically the contracting there again was ran through and approved by the Water Authority for the allocation of those storages to those local interests. All right, fun one. So the reservoir debt for Milford and Perry. So a little summary here. We had the $52 million got invested in Treasury bills in 2023 after the Senate sub for House Bill 2302. So thank you all for that. Thank you. Current Treasury bill valuation is 57.2. So we have made some interest there. I have my date wrong here, but there was a federal law change, and this would be January 4th of 2025 in the Word of 2024 document that got signed. And this changed the state storage contracts from compounding to simple interest. So if you look at the chart on the left, the top line, that's what we would have been paying kind of over time if we allowed those to go to end of term. And now the bottom line, that is the simple interest calculation. So right now our balance would be, it's 35 million, and if we allow them to go to term, it gains another 5.7 million. Oh yeah, and I'm supposed to work in the Public Water Supply Committee. They did want to give a real good thanks for you all for making this happen, so I wanted to convey that message. So if we look at like a May 2025 debt payoff, so say the decision was made, we got favorable terms from the federal government. Who knows what federal changes happen. If we want to do a May payoff, it'll be 35.1. There's some daily interest in there. And that would represent a $22.1 million savings for Kansans from that interest change. So that's pretty neat. If we let the contracts go to these full terms of 2034 and 2041, the compounding interest would have been $82 million, and then simple interest would have been the $41 million. So that's where if you look at like what is the maximum savings to the people of the state, ultimately it'd be that 41 million number. But that's if we don't call these into service, or we don't make the payment by 2034 and 2041. And yeah, the bottom line, storage availability and security for Kansans. So one of the challenges here is this storage is currently called future use. So future use by the Corps of Engineers gets to be used for other things. One of the things that can be used for is navigational purposes. So right now, under the terms, the Corps of Engineers can release between 3 to 6 feet for basically floating some barges on the Missouri. So that's kind of throwing a bomb on the table of like drought planning. You know, you don't really want to be in the midst of a drought and then they call for 6 feet of your storage to go float some barges. That's not a good place to be. Storage availability, again, that would be if you have a large industry, economic development, you have some growing cities along the river and they need to get new water rights. This would be the storage that they would be needing an interest in. So once we make the purchase, we call it into service, then we kind of take some of that navigational out-of-state influence risk off the table, and we have storage available for cities and industry for their future needs. Okay, Cottonwood Neosho River Basin. So in this basin, we have an assurance district and marketing contracts. We have 3 reservoirs that are each kind of very different in their own ways. John Redmond, as we talk about quite a bit, it'll be kind of in the middle there. Try to highlight it. Be right in the middle of the basin. One of its main function is it has a water quality allocation that's used for maintaining stream flows down the Neosho, down the state line. So that takes a certain portion of storage depending on how bad your drought is. If you got water coming in from your tributaries that helps you out, then you get to keep some storage in reserve. If not, we have to release some water to make sure we're hitting targets and we're keeping all those cities and industries supplied. This is a challenge also, especially if you get, if you can see those numbers on there, that's the number of acre feet those entities have. So combined, it's probably under 10,000 acre feet. A challenge here is there's limited storage available for future development. So if you do have an entity or something that comes in and they need 5,000 acre feet or they need a large quantity of water, we don't have a whole lot of storage to really support those additional demands at current rates. The 2 upper reservoirs, Council Grove and Marion, those are mostly going to be marketing contracts out of there. However, the Assurance District has bought a portion of both of those. And again, the Assurance District would be making releases to fulfill those demands and sort of those downstream river segments. The upper Neosho, it's a bit of a critical one because it does dry out really quick. So it's you can be kind of fine. You don't really need to use your reservoirs too much. And then a couple weeks go by and the base flows plummet and you got to start releasing. Currently, Emporia is sole sourced off of the Neosho. So if the Neosho River stops flowing, City of Emporia doesn't have water. So not a good outcome. And yeah, as John showed, this is just these bar charts. This is just kind of these surveys that we have gotten over time for the reservoirs. I'll say thanks to our Corps of Engineers friends, we've been able to get mostly new surveys for the Tulsa district. So I think by the end of this year, we'll have new surveys on all of those. So that's That's pretty cool. The water office, we have a survey program, so we did John Redmond here in 2023. You can see that picture on the lower left. That's the bathymetric survey, basically a map of the bottom. You see the dark area, that's the area that we dredged. So there still is a bit of a hole there from where we dredged it out. In the top right, this is kind of this problem of the one below it. That's your bar chart showing your storage over time, getting less. And the top right is sort of where's your demand going to go for Emporia. We have a projection from their local entity is that red dot. If you just look at their last 15 years of usage, that's that trend line. Where does it actually go and how does it relate with that loss of storage? Those are good questions. Those are the problems we're going to have to solve here of how we're going to keep those demands fulfilled. And if we can't do anything for the reservoir, what are alternatives? And the Verdigris Basin. So Verdigris Basin doesn't have an assurance district, but we do have a agreement with some of the entities for how we're going to operate this storage. There's a lot of marketing contracts that are utilized to maintain the flows of the lower system. So Fall River in Toronto, they make pretty low-level releases to keep those large sections of river flowing. I will point out, like the Public Wholesale 28, Fall River is a pretty small reservoir, and the wholesale district covers a pretty significant portion of that rural area. So they cover quite the footprint. Yeah, for the lower part, the Elk City, that's used really as sort of as demands are coming on and off, that's really sort of more the on and off trigger for that lower system. So similar graph as I showed earlier, if you incorporate like those pumping demands that we saw just this last fall and the natural flows, you get the dashed line. So we wouldn't have had enough water, we would have had entities without water. We're utilizing the reservoir releases, we get the black line, and that is flows at the independent stream gauge. So we need to maintain a certain amount of flows at independence to maintain all the downstream needs and have enough flow at the state line. So you can kind of see that, again, the proportional distribution of the releases there. The blue in that one would be Elk City. So Elk City, when it's making these releases, it can drop pretty quick. The Verdigris, I would say it's one that causes a little bit of stress there because it's a very fluctuating basin and go from very massive, large floods to just drying out, like seemingly pretty quick. So it's where Elk City really plays a good role there to fulfill that area. About time. So yeah, not all reservoirs are equal. The tall, basically the blue line, that's how much storage there is. The gray line is how much water comes into that lake on a median basis. So think an average annual basis. So on some of these, there's a whole bunch of water comes in, some of them not as much. John Redmond and Tuttle, on an average, they have a whole lot of water. Again, that lot of water, that brings all the sediment with it. So that's where some of those problems are. But bringing a whole lot of water is also what makes them good for trying to fulfill your demands and to maintain water supply needs. So that last slide was on an average annual basis. Things really change when we get into a drought. So this is showing, like, again, from the historical record, like if you had a 2% or your 2% conditions, so 98% of the time you're gonna have flows above this. But if you're in that nasty drought, what sort of inflows, what's the fuel that you have to keep the system running? This is where you get. So again, Tuttle Creek comes out really nice. It means even in a drought, we can still get some inflow events there. So that's very valuable. You can see how it changes with like ones that have a much smaller water basin. So like Council Grove, its watershed, basically the area, if there's a rain event, water will come into that lake. It's only 200 square miles. So you need a storm to hit that little 200 square mile area or that reservoir's going down. Tuttle Creek, alternatively, it has a drainage area of like 12,000 square miles. So you got a big area, you catch some rain, ends up in your reservoir. Each reservoir has different operational constraints for like downstream needs and other purposes. And then as John showed, there are these different designs. So what can we actually get out of the dam and what is a usable portion of the dam? So With that, I'll stand for questions.
Any questions? Representative Blex?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Richard, for your presentation. Couple of questions. If the state of Kansas purchases water storage rights in the reservoirs, will we have to continue to pay a share of the O&M on an annual basis or not?
So yeah, once we purchase it and once we call it in the service, we take on that proportional amount of the O&M, yes.
Okay, second. The Water Assurance District, in years past, as I recall, that was a way when Water Office didn't have any money, and we give them a little bit more, but that was a way to generate income. Is there some, and I'd like to know how much is generated with that, because in the case of Independence, they historically, Coffeyville Resources would pay for it. The water out of Elk City had to go past Independence, and they'd suck it out of there. And then they figured out a way they could take us to court, you guys to court, and get 30 days. And by 30 days, it would probably rain. They'd done that repeatedly, and they did not pay there. I guess my question is, and point is, the people that are actually making a fee payment, that water it goes past people that do not make any payments. Has there been any consideration of maybe, is that a significant enough source of income that you would completely eliminate that assurance district? Because it doesn't cost you guys nothing. All you got to do is turn a valve on.
So the assurance district for Verdigris, is that?
Well, just in general, across the board. Because my point is, some people pay and some people do not.
Yeah. So
And they seem to get a free ride while others have to pay.
there's a bit of some of this is water rights complexities here. So if we're down in the Verdigris, since there isn't an assurance district, it's basically the water marketing contracts are acting as the backup, the alternative source of supply. So if we're in a drought, there's a certain portion that is calculated as natural flow that Division of Water Resources gets, and that is allocated on a priority basis depending on where you're at in the line for your water right. And then the marketing contract is to provide that water to supplement those natural flows. So,
But if we buy the storage rights, do we need the assurance district?
yeah, because actually the assurance district, in that case, they're the ones contracting. They purchase the rights to the storage, and then we operate that storage. The state acts as the entity to basically make sure all the needs of those entities are met.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
I think there's 6 of our members that this is the first time they've heard a lot about the reservoirs. And I apologize, guys. Those of us been on the committee for several years have heard this several times. It changes slightly each year. If you have further questions, and I'm sure you will when you get away from the room here, please ask these guys. I guess I have a question. If we do nothing, what's our time frame until we have to step up and do something?
Yeah, it's going to be very different depending on the basin and depending on the reservoir. So I would say, like Council Grove, for meeting those full demands of sort of Emporia, you got like 20-some years before we would start getting to where we would have to reduce that contract that we could issue them. So for some of these, it will be a decision there. If the state can't contract for more yield than it can provide. So it would either be starting to constrain those contracts that we issue, which might hamper demand growth or economic development, or we just have to find alternatives. So in that case, that's maybe we're interconnecting them to another resource, maybe to something sourced from like Melbourne Reservoir or from like the Kansas Basin to connect to some basins that have a little bit better long-term trajectory.
In 2018, we spent $20 million on John Redmond. What's the anticipated need in that in the near future?
For
John Redmond.
Yeah.
Well, not necessarily. Did we buy another 20 years on John Redmond with $20 million?
I would say no. What bought us time at John Redmond is we did what's called a reallocation. So we basically raised the pool That's what bought us sort of most of our time. The dredging itself, if you look at like what comes in on an average annual basis, we removed about 3 years worth of sediment. But I think Dr. Shelley and I have been working through an economic study here to try to evaluate that, and you can kind of dismiss that at first at face value, but if you look at it in that lens, we're still benefiting from that removal of sediment, which we wouldn't be benefiting from today. So, yeah.
Anyway, I think we need to cheer on the high-pressure injection and the suction methods, and hopefully those are successful, but we'll find out in the near future on those experiments. Thank you very much. We are adjourned. Thursday, we'll have a presentation on fluoridation. This is not a hearing. We will not be taking any action, but we will listen to several people talk about the fluoridation issue. Okay, thank you.